Greetings ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer 2 Naval Battles Part 3. Now, Part 1 and 2 of this video series was looking at the implementation of naval combat in the next expansion of Total War Warhammer. If you haven't already, I'd recommend you guys check out Part 1. There should be a link popping up in the top right hand corner of your screen now, or if not, please do check the description and there'll be a link to the playlist of my naval battle series of Total War Warhammer 2 there, just to catch you guys up on my current thinking behind the game and what naval combat might look like in the Total War Warhammer universe. Now, I go over my reasons for the likelihood of this occurring and the way in which existing systems within a game once known as Man of War really sink in well with naval combat as it has existed in the Total War series so far, and how the two of them might come together to form the basis of naval combat in Total War Warhammer 2 or the first expansion, whichever you prefer to call it. Now, this video isn't looking at the mechanics or the units of fleet combat, but is looking at some of the possible inspiration for admiral vessels or for legendary Lord Admiral vessels within the Total War Warhammer universe. Now, there are some very famous lords in Warhammer that are preoccupied, that make their living on the ocean, but this isn't really a lore video looking at them. I mean, we have characters like Luther Harkon, the pirate of Lustria, who's a vampire pirate and has a zombie crew. We have Aelin, the Sea Lord of the High Elves. These guys will probably be legendary admirals in any Total War Warhammer game where naval combat is implemented. But for this video, we're going to be looking at a follow-on game that Games Workshop released, where they released really just a series of very unique and powerful vessels that could make up the concept, if not the exact implementation, of admiral vessels in Total War Warhammer. Whereas Man of War went into production in 1993, went out of production in 95, then got completely withdrawn by 98, they didn't really have a naval combat game, Warhammer, in that meantime. But then in 2011, they released a game called Dreadfleet. Now, Dreadfleet tried to address some of the perceived problems with Man of War. The ideas that Man of War models were very crude and ugly looking, and that's maybe what robbed them of some of the appeal, and there wasn't maybe enough lore or personal connection with characters that were present in Man of War. And they kind of took it to the other extreme and kind of built a game solely focused on individual characters and individual vessels. The game itself, I'm not going to go into the rules because that's not really what this video is about. It's just to give you guys an idea of the concepts behind the ships in Dreadfleet and how they might be implemented in Total War Warhammer to make up admiral ships, and just to give you guys an idea and a lot of brief hint of some of the source material that Creative Assembly might be working with when they create their naval combat in Total War Warhammer. So Dreadfleet itself was focused on two main factions, bad guys and good guys, and they each built up a little fleet of their own and they went and did war. Now, the game itself is led very much by a kind of narrative campaign, and there's a sort of good bit, well, I want to say a good bit of story, but there's some story behind what's going on rather than just an excuse to get some really cool looking ships together and have them duke it out. So to start off the story of the Dreadfleet sort of campaign and where everyone's coming from and who they all are, I thought I'd go through it narratively to introduce you to the characters as the story developed. So we start off our story in Sartosa. Now, Sartosa is an island off of Tilia, and it's very much a pirate haven, sort of like the Tortuga or one of the old Caribbean islands where just pirates run Sartosa. It's very much a pirate's hotbed. This is where they tend to operate out of, and they can always sell their stolen goods in Sartosa and operate out of the island. And it's all really built around piracy, seems to be the main occupation for the region. Now, Captain Jaego Roth was a very well-known character in Sartosa itself. He was a pirate of some renown already. He commanded the ship known as the Night Watch, and he was out pirating, as pirates are wont to do. And eventually he returned home, and this is around the year of the Imperial calendar 2522. So really just sort of bang on Warhammer timeline and a little bit after the start of Total War Warhammer. But they can fudge the numbers a little bit, I'm sure, in case they're looking to implement any of the content of the Dreadfleet game. And he's returning home, and he finds the whole of Sartosa set to flame. Everything's burning. He rushes his ship into the dock. He, like a lunatic, dives off his ship, runs into the burning buildings, and he's frantically searching for his family. Unfortunately, his wife and child are both dead, having been consumed by the flames, and he looks for his father, who was a very famous cartographer in his own right within the Sound of Sartosa. Finds his father's corpse, and his father's corpse seems to be hunched over and protecting several artifacts. These artifacts are an Eldritch moondial, a sea chart pinned to the inside of a sea turtle shell, and an enchanted Araby spyglass. So Jaego is incensed, he wants revenge, his family's just been killed and put to the sword, he wants to know who carried out this raid. And he learns from the survivors the raid was carried out by the Dreadfleet. Now, the Dreadfleet has long been something that had been sort of mythically spoken about amongst the ranks of sailors and merchants who were often spent time on the ocean. The idea is that the Dreadfleet had arrived some number of years ago, and it had a supernatural nature about it. And since then, any kind of shipwreck or battle or any kind of event that claims sailors' lives, you won't find hide nor hair of wreckage or of the sailors themselves. They just disappear. And the sailors and merchants and things are all whispering amongst themselves that what happens is you get sucked into this place known as sort of the underworld for sailors, known as the Galleon's Graveyard. And at times, the Dreadfleet was known to pour out from seemingly nowhere, raid and destroy and kill, and then disappear off as quickly as they'd arrive. It very much takes a kind of supernatural element. You'll see this recurring. You guys should really just picture that someone at Games Workshop, the creators of this game and all Warhammer content, essentially just watched the Pirates of the Caribbean Johnny Depp film series and were like, oh, we can make a game out of that. So keep that in the back of your heads as we go through the rest of the narrative in this story. You'll see some similarities, and you kind of get where their inspiration came from with this game and the campaign behind it. So Jaego's like, oh, this is the Dreadfleet. We need to go and raise a force and kill them all. And they know that the Dreadfleet's kind of made up of undead and spirits and all sorts of nastiness. So his first thought is he's heard stories of the power of the cult of Sigmar working against the undead. They obviously have strong ties to the witch hunters, and warrior priests are known to be able to smite undead with their sort of holy vengeance, as it were. So Jaego, still being a pirate, kind of has to sneak his way there, but he sails round the coast of Bretonnia, and he gets to Marienburg, at which point he disguises his pirate ship, the Night Watch, as a kind of merchant ship. They sort of dangle stuff and nets, and they just make themselves look inconspicuous and not like a war galley. So they sneak past Marienburg, and they head to Altdorf. And in Altdorf, they meet with the sort of heads or whoever they can meet in this cult of Sigmar, and they say, please help us, we've got this undead threat, we need to kill it. And the cult of Sigmar, or Church of Sigmar, whichever way you prefer to reference it, just say, look, I'm sorry, at the moment we're fighting a war somewhere else against, and it's only ever specified the enemies of the Empire, so we're not sure which war the cult of Sigmar is referring to, but they say they have to use their resources elsewhere and can't afford to help this pirate and to avenge his family. Being incensed at this, Jaego is outraged. He just goes and he steals their flagship itself, the Heldenhammer, which is pictured here on the right. Now, the Heldenhammer is an enormous ship. It has some 180 cannon. It has what is essentially a temple or a citadel to Sigmar on the back. And on the front, it has this huge statue of Sigmar, which is essentially a steam-powered animatron that can smash down that hammer and any ship that the Heldenhammer happens to ram into. And it just smashes down the hammer and crushes it to pieces. So he's stolen probably one of the most powerful ships in the Imperial Navy, and then headed out to the open ocean. Now, people are annoyed at this, and they do chase after him, and along the River Reich, a pursuit takes place. But Jaego, knowing that this would happen, set up an ambush, and his other ship, the Night Watch, comes and helps him intercept, and they destroy the Cult of Sigmar ship that had been sent to pursue them. Jaego makes a clean getaway, although in that battle, he does lose his original ship, the Night Watch. Now, in terms of the Heldenhammer that Jaego stole, there was a stat card given for it, speed 12. It relied on sailing. If you guys have seen part 1 and 2, you know the Man of War series also had a sort of sailing mechanic, and Total War in the past have used sailing mechanics in their games before. So that would be an easy enough thing to implement for them. So as a sailing mechanic, handling, crew skill, broadside, which essentially it's cannon that fire a bit sort of power, and it has the hammer rule itself. And the captains and the crew would play parts whenever raiding would take place, and that's essentially how you'd play the game with combat. Now, I've included these kind of stat cards just so you can compare the upcoming ships against one another and see how they stack up. But this was the Heldenhammer, a massive vessel, huge, very imposing, massive hammer at the front. Really quite a cool looking item indeed, and it'd be fantastic to have an Imperial Admiral with a similar looking ship ship of the Cult of Sigmar, just to stand out from the rest of the possible fleet vessels that I've suggested in part 1 and 2. In terms of the Dreadfleet itself and the people who attack Jaego's family, these are led by a character come known as Count Noctilus, and you can see Nocturnal and Nautilus kind of mixed up there, you get it. He was not always known as Count Noctilus, he was in fact once known as Nicolaus von Carstein, obviously the von Carstein family who make up the Vampire Count faction. Now he got sick of all the infighting and power games within the von Carstein line and kind of left to go seek power for himself, find an alternative source of power. And on his travels around the world, he eventually discovered this underworld known as the Galleon Graveyard. And he found that this is a place that could draw vast power for himself, and he used that power to summon in the corpses and shipwrecks of all the kind of ships around the world whenever they fall into the ocean and bring them to serve him in the afterlife. Once he located this realm, he had so much power he was able to translocate his castle and the rocky mountain upon which it stood upon back in Sylvania, one assumes, and transport it to him in the Galleon's Graveyard, and construct a seafaring vessel out of the wreckage of dozens of other ships he'd managed to summon into this realm he was now very much the master of. And this ship is what eventually made up the ship he now has, which is called the Blood Reaver. And the Blood Reaver sort of just allows him to go around the world, collecting more corpses, causing more destruction, raiding and pillaging, just to as a sort of ultimate motivation to increase his own power, to swell his ranks. That's about all he's really going for. Now, Count Noctilus on the Blood Reaver has a number of abilities. The hull itself can regenerate from the wrecks of other ships, which is his ability now. He also has such immense power, he can now control sea monsters and summon sea monsters to aid him in his fight. And he has a broadside, of course, but it's not necessarily as powerful as the Heldenhammer, as you can see from the stat up there. He's finally also reliant on sails to get around as a means of locomotion. And all round, he leads this Dreadfleet. And he's got this Dreadfleet made up of a number of different characters, but we'll get into those in due course. For the moment, this is the character that killed Jaego's family, that Jaego is hunting and trying to hunt down and kill and revenge himself upon. So going back to Jaego at this point had left the waters of the Empire and had come back down south, past Bretonnia, past Estalia, past Tilia, and was heading to the lands of the Tomb Kings in Kemri. So he's gotten there, and the reason he's down here is because he knows that although he spent his last money to hire the most motley crew he could find to take the Heldenhammer, to pilot his old ship as well, and to get revenge, he'd essentially used all his savings, and he knew to beat the Dreadfleet, he'd need more than just this one ship, the Heldenhammer, and he needed to seek out other powerful naval vessels. And to do that, he probably needed money to reward them with. So he goes down to Kemri because he's heard that some of the Tomb King cities have an obscene amount of gold within their tombs. So he goes down there and takes 300 of his hardiest men to raid a town in the land of the Tomb Kings known as Zandri. And they fight their way into Zandri, fighting tooth and nail for every foot, fighting skeletons, fighting living statues, fighting massive living sphinxes. And they don't really get more than half a mile into the city itself before they're forced to retreat just due to the sheer numbers facing off against them. But they do manage to raid a handsome sum, and of the original 300, although only 80 returned, each man returned with what essentially equated to a king's ransom with him. So he has almost huge and unlimited funds at this point to reap his revenge against Count Noctilus. However, one cannot get away with raiding the Tomb King scot-free, and the Tomb King of that area was a guy known as Amanhotep. And Amanhotep, vowing revenge for as long as he exists in undeath against Jaego, promptly orders his minions to construct a new vessel by which he will hunt down this mortal who dared to interfere and to rob from the likes of him. Amanhotep gets his minions to build the Curse of Zandri. And the Curse of Zandri is a huge battle barge with a massive tomb pyramid in its center. It's protected by 5 huge Ushapti armed with great weapons, and it has a special weapon upon it which focuses the sun's beams into a burning ray of light that can set ablaze enemy ships. And with this new powerful ship, he rides off in hunt of Jaego. And although we're not expecting the Tomb Kings until the second expansion expansion of the game, which is when I'm expecting naval combat to become part of the game. If not then it probably never will. But this kind of concept that they've come up with here for the Curse of Xandri really suits the Tomb Kings well. It has that design of ancient Egypt with the ideas of the sun being used as a weapon, while the undead are in the tomb, the actual pyramid tomb, on the boat, and they've included the incorporation of the Shapti, which are the living statues that the Tomb Kings have, some of the best Tomb King weapons they have at their disposal. So it really combines all the different elements of the Tomb King culture and would really make a great template from which to base kind of admiral level ships in the Tomb King armies. And I really hope they consider this when they are designing those vessels, because I think it looks fantastic, and from conceptually it really suits the entire aesthetic of the Tomb Kings. Now, Jaego at this time, upon leaving the lands of the Tomb Kings with his new wads of cash, was looking for new powerful ships he could sort of pay to join his cause. And he got word of a powerful ship in the lands of Araby, and so he sailed west to Araby to encounter a chap known as the Gloden Magnus. Now, the Gloden Magnus was a very powerful mage, and his ship was known as the Flaming Scimitar. Now, the Gloden Magnus didn't take much beyond money to convince, but it took 16 full treasure chests to convince the Gloden Magnus to join Jaego's cause. And for that price, join he did. Now, his ship, the Flaming Scimitar, is powered by sail, but he also has enslaved 2 jinn, which are kind of elemental spirits, to the ship, and they help it operate. There's the Jinn of Wind, who can help the ship move quicker by blowing in its sail, and the Jinn of Fire, who the Magnus commands to attack other ships. He can also summon sea nymphs to aid in the protection of his ship, and he really fires off magic spells as the main weapon that the ship has, being a powerful mage himself. So this is the Gloden Magnus's Flying Scimitar, and it was a powerful addition to Jaego's quest. Now, it's one of the few units we've ever seen from Games Workshop in terms of Araby itself. I think we've had Al-Muqta's Desert Dogs and this, and I don't think there's a lot more we've seen, but this might inform other design for the Araby faction if we ever see it from Total War, Warhammer, and Creative Assembly. So with this very powerful magic ship joins up with Jaego, and Jaego gets wind of another character nearby, a pirate of some ill repute, known as Aranessa Saltspite. Now, Aranessa was born a mutant with sort of scales on her skin and spikes, and she was born with deformed legs, which she herself chopped off and replaced with 2 spikes. Now, she's a consummate fighter. No one's really 100% sure of her origins. Some have hypothesized that she's in fact the daughter of Manan, the god of the sea. Others say she was just born of a Nordic tribe who rejected her because of her mutations. But suffice it to say, she's gone on to become a pirate queen of sorts in the oceans around the world. Now, with her, it took a little bit more convincing to get her and her ship called the Swordfish to join up with Jaego's crew. It took him a week of sort of harassing and haranguing and a full crate of sapphires to convince the pirate queen to join up with his cause. Now, the Swordfish, which is the ship she brings into battle, is a hardy vessel. It's sort of decorated with a number of shells from sea monsters and teeth from sea monsters, and she's attached some of these appendages to the front of her ship to create a very powerful battering ram with which to sink other vessels. But that's essentially what she's decorated most of her ship with, is just sort of bits and pieces of sea monsters they've slain or come across. I think this would be interesting. I'm not sure which faction she'd necessarily be attached to. Maybe Norska, you could argue if the Norska sort of tribe thing is true, or maybe an independent. But this is why I think with Dreadfleet, it's only really concepts they might take from Dreadfleet and not necessarily the characters themselves. Because a lot of the characters don't necessarily fit into specific factions, or they don't necessarily fit in, or they're kind of hybrids of parts of one faction and parts of another. So it's not a clean transfer in terms of making all of these characters legendary lords, but I hope they use some of the ideas for the ships because they're really cool looking models and really cool looking ships. But anyway, so Jaego takes these 2 new ships, they get incorporated to his fleet, and the idea is I think they have a number of smaller vessels as well with them. It's not just these big ass ships roaming around together. And they set off trying to conquer the Dreadfleet. And at this point, Jaego thinks he has enough military force to take them on. About sort of a year starts to roll by since the events of the burning of his home and killing of his family. And in that time, Jaego's looked to collect a number of different pieces of information because he knows he can't just face off against the undead without necessarily having a plan to stop them. So he's collecting all this information. It seems that the artifacts his father had sort of protected or left behind were key clues to how to access this place where the Dreadfleet were coming from. And he has the help of Magnus the Gold to kind of help him out and go through the magic of it and try and wade through what exactly these items can do and how they can help their cause. But at the same time, they're very much trying to track the Dreadfleet. Now, the Dreadfleet at this point, I've mentioned Count Noctilus. Count Noctilus isn't riding alone, as it were. He also has under his command Captain Vangheist and the Shade Wraith. Now, Captain Vangheist was in life a captain who sought immortality and kept questing it out, and eventually he did in fact find it, but not in the way he'd hoped. And he's fallen under the power of Noctilus, of Count Noctilus, and kind of just rocks around with him to form part of the Dreadfleet. The Shade Wraith, which is his ship, is essentially an ethereal ship. It has the power to kind of float above the waves and move that way, and it's very hard to hit because it is ethereal, much like on the tabletop we already have. So it'd be interesting to see an ethereal kind of admiral ship in Total War Warhammer. I think that would make a cool little addition to the game. And he's the captain of this, and he goes around and he's under Noctilus's command. Another ship under Noctilus's command is the Scabrous, captained by Scretch, war chief of the Sorbet clan. Now, Scretch was a Skaven pirate of some renown in the oceans already. Him and his crew had done a number of dastardly deeds, but eventually they were on the open ocean and they were drawn in the nighttime by a glowing light. Thinking it was a easy prey merchant ship or something of the like, they were promptly swallowed up by an orb Leviathan. Now, for you guys who maybe missed part 1 of my naval battle series where I went through the sea monsters of the Total War Warhammer world, the Leviathan is essentially like a deep water fish with needle-like teeth that can swallow you in one gulp. And some varieties of them have a little orb, much like the nature videos you've all seen before, but imagine one of them the size of a whale or something like that. Now, the Skaven ship actually largely survived intact in the Leviathan's stomach. The Skaven, quickly kind of panicking and trying to figure out a way out and having most of his crew survive, started just eating the Leviathan from the inside out, and they promptly killed the creature. Now, they couldn't force open its mouth, and they couldn't eat their way through its flesh quickly enough to escape, and they thought they were going to die in there. They just, fair enough, they had food, but they thought they were going to asphyxiate and run out of air. That was their fear. But luckily enough, Count Noctilus was going through the oceans at this time and had probably got whiffed of this dead Leviathan on the wind and thought I could probably do an undead sea monster on my side. That would be a useful thing to have, and reanimated it. Not knowing there were Skaven inside, but indeed Skaven they were, and so thankful were they to Noctilus that they decided to serve him and be a part of his fleet. They promptly started to kind of hollow out and carve off the skin from the Leviathan, and essentially they made their ship in the corpse of this dead animal. They set up ranks of cannons, and they attached a screaming bell in place of where its orb of luminescent light used to be, and that goes off and has a screaming bell effect on the enemy. So essentially, this became a very useful tool of Noctilus's army. The thing itself is just a disgusting, it must be horrible to live in. It's essentially living in a whale's carcass. That must be just absolutely revolting. But this fires, in terms of what their weapons are, it fires warp lightning at people, because, you know, they're Skaven and they love their warp lightning. And this whole ship is just quite the monstrosity to behold. Another ship that's joined Noctilus in his sort of quest for world domination, I guess, or sea domination, or just to help Noctilus increase his own power, is the Black Kraken, under the command of Tudrek Hackheart. But Tudrek started life off as a dwarf in Barak Var. He was a very gifted engineer and in fact the uncontested master of submersible engineering. However, he let his petty jealousies get the better of him and attempted to kill one of his long-term rivals, a chap called Brock the Red. But having been caught trying to kill Brock the Red, he was banished from Barak Var and for dwarven holds from dwarven kingdoms as a whole. Now, rather than take the Slayer Oath or anything like that, he absconds with his latest creation, which is this sort of automaton, black, submersible Kraken machine. Now, this machine had been designed by him and had come to him in a series of feverish dreams. In fact, the machine had a soul of a demon embedded into it, much like the Chaos Dwarves have done with their own technology. And to kind of find sanctuary, to find someone who kind of agreed with him, who could use him, he ended up joining the Dreadfleet. So the Black Kraken is a submersible that I imagine works very much like the submersibles in the rest of the Dwarven Fleet, which I feature in part 1 of this series. And here it is here. Unfortunately, guys, I could not dig out a stat card for the Black Kraken. I apologize for that. If any of you guys know his stats or anything, do please post it in the comments. But I couldn't find the stat card for him, and I went through a PDF of the Dreadfleet book, although it was written in French. I couldn't find the rules for it in that, so I'm guessing the stats were on the cards themselves, and I just couldn't find an image of that short of going on eBay and buying a copy of the game itself. But it's a very cool looking model, the kind of mechanical squid that just drags things down. But that's the Black Kraken for you. I think it's one of the cooler models in the Dreadfleet game. So the Dreadfleet at this point consists of the Blood Reaver, the Scarberus, the Black Kraken, and the Shade Wraith, as well as the Curse of Xandri, which joined up with Count Noctilus once it realized he was hunting the same man who had robbed his city. All going around the world, marauding, pillaging, looting. Now, Jaego thinks he's figured out a pattern to their movement and sets up an ambush in alliance with the Tilian fleet. And they're all anchored just off of Lucini. And indeed, he managed to predict their movements, and the Dreadfleet shows up with the rolling fog and they emerge out of it looking to attack. Now, him and his group of powerful alliance ships attack the Dreadfleet, and it's a fierce battle. The Tilian fleet comes in and tries to cut the Dreadfleet off from escaping, but because of their magical ability to seemingly disappear into nothingness, the Dreadfleet just gets a few yards away and the fog rolls back in and covers them, and then when the fog clears out again, the Dreadfleet has escaped. Although they thought they could sort of salvage victory from that, they did take heavy casualties, but undeterred, Jaego knew that he just had to come up with a way of getting to wherever this fleet is disappearing to. And he started to sort of work on it with Magnus the Golden, and they eventually started to sail south, and essentially just looking to still track down the Dreadfleet, but still thinking there's a way to access wherever they're disappearing off to. So they set off in pursuit, going further south. On their journey south, they ran into Brock the Red Gunnison. Now, Brock is, of course, the arch-rival of Tordrek, the chap who's the captain of the Black Kraken. And they find him, and it looks like his ironclad's been crushed in the fist of a giant. But really, it's just the damage the Black Kraken has done to it. Jaego thinking, if I help this dwarf out and his surviving crew, and the dwarves like to keep grudges, they might equally like to pay back those who help them. So he fishes the dwarven crew out, says, how can I help you guys out? And they say, take us to Barak Var, please. On the trip to Barak Var, Jaego and Brock the Red come to talking, and eventually Jaego Roth explains to Brock that he's actually seen this Black Kraken, and the Black Kraken is part of the Dreadfleet currently. So getting into Barak Var, Brock the Red kind of ponders on this. He helps Jaego and his crew restock as reward. He then takes over the captainship of a Grudge Breaker class battleship known as Grimnir's Thunder. And he says to Jaego, look, you and I seem to be hunting the same people. Let's team up. I'll join your fleet. Let's go after these guys. And I will get revenge on Tordrek for sinking my beloved vessel and for trying to kill me as well. So he sets off, and they've got another ship in their fleet. Now, Grimnir's Thunder is a huge ironclad ship. It has 2 dirigibles it can launch from its hull, which are essentially war balloons it can launch. It has flame cannons on it, and it has broadside cannons that can fire on those directions as well. Like the dwarven fleets of the Man of War game, Grimnir's Thunder can repair itself in battle due to the skill of the dwarven engineers. And really, all round, it's just a bit of a powerhouse with fantastically thick armor, as well as being able to repair itself. It's a literal sea tank. So with this new huge weapon at his disposal, Jaego and the Gloden Magnus have eventually cracked the code of his father's stuff, and they understand that the Dreadfleet is essentially escaping off to this other world. And now I always slaughter this, and I apologize to my German listeners in advance, but Geheimenstadt, which is the night in the Warhammer world where the green moon, the chaos moon, and the normal moon are both full at the same time in the sky. And this is a time of particular sort of magic and chaos magic and stuff like that. So Magnus sets about sort of casting the necessary magics, and they set off to a certain location where the veil between the worlds is very thin. And indeed it works. On this night of magic, they manage to break through the veil and they're suddenly greeted with a horrific thunderstorm, and their ships are kind of scattered around the place to different areas. And when they all sort of come to and the weather clears, they realize they've reached their destination. They've reached the galleon's graveyard. Now, they're all split up at this point, and they fight a number of running battles to reunite themselves in the galleon's graveyard. And this is really the setting of the Dreadfleet game, in this kind of otherworldly realm where the good guy fleet is trying to take out the bad guy fleet. And this is how you have all the excuses for one-on-one battles, two-on-two battles, stuff like that with different ships coming in, because they've all been spread out is the idea. So this is where this is kind of where the game universe takes place, the board game universe takes place. But eventually they get together and they run into another chap known as Prince Eurelian. Now, Prince Eurelian is the eldest son of the Phoenix King Finnebar, the Seafarer. And he's had a love for the ocean since he was an infant and is quite the able seaman. What this Prince of Ulthuan is doing in the middle of this underworld sea graveyard is not known to them at the time, but eventually it's established that the prince lost his younger brother in the stomach of a worm leech. So kind of like a sea monster, and the galleon graveyard seems to be where the sea monster has sort of escaped off to, and Eurelian is trying to recover the body of his brother before he goes back and faces his father so they can give his brother a proper funeral. Or at least avenge his brother by killing this bloody sea monster. So they encounter him and he agrees to join them. Now his ship is known as the Sea Drake, and it is a monster. It's a huge ship with massive towers. Instead of cannon, it fires bolt throwers. It has a massive ramming head at the front, and Prince Eurelian himself has two faithful dragon companions whom he can launch one at a time to help him in his naval battles. And these can prove really devastating. Obviously, they're dragons, and it's the ocean, and there are boats made of wood. So these can prove truly devastating aids to him in battle. And they just perch on the ship. It's that massive a ship. So now we have the fleet of Order completely assembled. Here are the good guys. We've got the Swordfish, we've got the Sea Drake, we've got Heldenhammer, and we've got Grimnir's Thunder. And we have the Flying Scimitar to complete the group. After a series of battles with the Dreadfleet, let's call them the Order Fleet, shall we? The Order Fleet finally takes on the Dreadfleet, and they face off in a huge battle in the middle of what is known as the Maelstrom, which seems to be the source of all of Noctilus's power and the source of really what's powering this realm of the galleon's graveyard. So these two fleets face off in the center of what is the galleon's graveyard, and they start to just go at it. They start firing cannons, the dragons are firing overhead, the dirigibles, the Black Kraken is emerging every so often and dragging a ship down or crushing its hull and damaging it severely. This horrible smelly dead fish is pottering around with its bloody bell, making a nuisance of itself. And eventually the side of Order, the good guys if you will, realize that this is untenable. There's too many undead boarding parties. This bloody submergible Black Kraken is a hassle and is probably going to kill them all. They don't really stand much of a chance. All they can do is try to stifle out the center of Count Noctilus's power, which is this maelstrom itself. So they allow the currents to take them into this twirling vortex. Now at this point, if you imagine the end of, I think it's Pirates of the Caribbean, World's End, where the two ships are kind of spinning around the whirlpool. I think that's kind of what it is, except more redness and lightning, I imagine, in the Warhammery way. And I'm pretty sure they lifted this scene from the story from that film. So imagine that, if you will. And so the wizard, the Gloden Magnus, says to the Heldenhammer, before the battle, they convince him to take these big urns and throw them into the vortex, and that should affect the magic enough that everything returns to normal, and the kind of galleon graveyard is finished as a kind of other world and the source of Noctilus's power. So they all go to war and they're fighting, and they're all just trying to buy the Heldenhammer time so it can get to the center of this vortex and drop these urns in, and one by one each of the ships are taken out by the bad guys. But they did manage to buy Heldenhammer enough time, and he goes into the vortex, twirling round and round, deeper and deeper, and eventually he drops in the urns, and the souls that Magnus the Golden had collected of certain djinn and magical entities, I'm not exactly sure what they are, managed to affect the magic of the vortex enough that they destroy it, and the day is won, but there's no signs of the Dreadfleet. There's no signs of the Heldenhammer. There's no signs of the other ships that were involved in the battle. But now when ships sink in the open ocean of the Warhammer world, they don't disappear. You find sailors' corpses, you find wreckage, you find survivors. They're not all sucked into this otherworldly realm anymore. And that is really the Hollywood ending of the story of the Dreadfleet. Now, looking at all the different models we've gone through and all the different stories, I hope you guys get to see some of the cooler concepts that could be used in implementing admirals and legendary admirals in Total War Warhammer. The concept of an ethereal flying ship, the concept of the Heldenhammer with the massive hammer of Sigmar that comes down and smashes ships that it's managed to ram into, the Flaming Scimitar, which is a magic ship powered by these two huge djinn entities that attack and help the ship go faster, the Sea Drake with the two dragons flying around it. And it just kind of fires off your imagination for some of the possibilities in the naval fleets of Total War Warhammer. And that was really just the point of this video, guys, to show you some of the concepts behind the ships in the Dreadfleet and to give you an idea of some of the exciting stuff we might be able to see if they implement naval combat into Total War Warhammer 2 or the first expansion, whichever you prefer to call it. I hope you guys found this video entertaining and informative. I would love to see kind of, once they introduce Chaos Dwarves to the game, Black Kraken equivalent, just being a submersible that goes through and attacks other ships. I think that would look amazing. The Blood Reaver is okay, but it's just kind of a wreckage ship, a big fortress. We'll see that with the Black Arks of the Dark Elves. And the Pyramid ship with the Ray is pretty cool as well. And the Skaven, see, the problem is that some of the stuff just doesn't fit into a singular faction. Like the Skaven ship, which is just an undead corpse of a sea monster, wouldn't really work without undead magic. I suppose you could make the argument it was an invention by Clan Moulder, who tend to be the clan of Skaven, who like to mess with living beings and breed monsters and stuff like that. I think it's Moulder. Let me know if I'm wrong on that one. You could maybe fudge it so that they're the ones who invented the kind of the Leviathan, the Scarberus. But stuff like the Pirate Queen, I'd like, where would she fall into it? Stuff like that. But I just like Dreadfleet because it introduces a couple of cool concepts and some really fantastic designs as well in terms of what we might be able to see in ships in the Warhammer world. Now, for me, I'd like to see these implemented as leadership ships, kind of admiral fleets, legendary admirals, stuff like that. But I'd still like to see the main body of functioning battle fleets be made up of the Man of War complement, because that game was designed with entire fleets in mind, and I'd like to see, and it really builds in a way that is very easily translatable into any naval system in the Total War series. So that about sums it up for the Naval Battle series. I may do videos on the lore of potential admirals and stuff like that in the Warhammer universe if naval combat is ever announced, because that would be an interesting aspect to go into itself. But this was more of a study in concepts and kind of the history of naval combat in the Warhammer universe and what it might look like in Total War Warhammer. As I say, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed it. Thanks very much for watching. Do please subscribe for more Total War Warhammer content and speculation for what we might have coming up in the Total War Warhammer series and some other RPG and strategy games as well. I've been the Inept General. Please do drop a like. It really helps the channel grow, and I hope to see you guys next time. Thanks very much.